Thanks, Adam. He says great message. He has no idea what I'm going to say. Yeah, there we go. On theme. I was enjoying this morning, Scott, where is he? Somewhere around here. Maybe not. He has this amazing ability. Whenever I'm leading a meeting and Scott's on, he's going to completely undercut and completely undermine all your expectations. And we had, what's the warbling, the Handel, what was the song? Handel's Long Lost Baby? Handel's Messiah. Fancier than I am. I'm guessing that was you, Scott, not Adam. Scott, yeah, there we go. And also the other one, I can't remember, it's gone out of my mind, but I know that one because we listened to Heart FM Christmas in the car. Yeah, I absolutely love that one. So my point is, Scott's full of surprises, and that's pretty good metaphor for one of the qualities about God we're going to explore this morning. So big compliment to you there, Scott. As Adam mentioned, this morning we are looking at the final of the three gifts, which is really the first, which is gold. And gold, of course, is about light and radiance and hope and kingship. And we're just going to be exploring a little of that this morning. But to start, here's 4-5-year-old me, ready for a nativity, just to start off a bit light. And I love nativities, so I shall be here next week. I think it's apparently a bit of a curious British tradition. I thought it was global, but I love it. And I've always felt that being one of the three kings is probably the best role. You agree? Well, I could give my name to it. I'm not going to say that too much, because when we used to do Santa's on the High Street, you used to get roped into stuff, and I hated that. Sorry, I'm very uncomfortable in that kind of situation now. I've grown up, but look at me there. I look chuffed, and I've got my hands all Prince Charles and King Charles. And so I'm wearing my robes. And could we have some music, Mike? This music used to play in my church nativity. You can see as a young person, that made me feel pretty splendid. And we had these cardboard cutout camels. We can probably pause there. And we'd process along the aisles. We didn't walk, we proceeded everywhere. And I only really mention this very tangentially because the nativity we did was done to a tape. And the tape just played whether or not we were ready. And you can imagine with parents, the wings of the play were very stressful. But there was this one line, and the voice on the tape had one of those amazing, epic tape voices. And the line I've been remembering is, it goes, "We saw his star at its rising, and we have come to worship him," like a proper magi, So we've seen his star at its rising, and we've come to worship him. And I've been thinking a lot about that little passage because it's very unexpected in a way. And what struck me about that is that God spoke to the Magi through the stars. Look up there, the stars. And given they were some kind of astrologers, probably, it's very considerate of God, I think. Given that as Christians, we don't really think God should be doing that. The sort of astrology stuff. I don't think we're okay, in theory, with God speaking through astrology, but God doesn't seem to really care what we think. And that's kind of what we're going to be thinking about this morning, that God spoke to them in a language that they understood, and he met them where they were at, whether we like it or not. And to try and better understand this scene, I want us just to briefly imagine that you're a magi. Look at the left hand of that picture. You're dressed in your robes. There's the scent of camel and frankincense in the air. It's dark. It's probably freezing cold in the desert. The sand would be all icy because of what it gets like. You're watching the stars. You're trying to work out what their riddles are, which right now is pretty hard. But I've done some impressive photoshopping. Because then erupting from nowhere, there's this giant, burning, golden light. Not a silly, tiny blue star, a massive eruption of light in the night sky. And as I imagine myself in that desert, I kind of get where the Magi were coming from, right? I understand what they saw God saying, because as I look at that star, it's like I can hear God saying, let there be light. And of course, let there be light is the phrase that marks the beginning of a new creation, which is ever so exciting. So Christmas in the Gospel of Matthew begins with God putting a big old symbol in the sky that says he is doing a new thing. And that's what his star is there for. A new creation is coming. And in a similar way, the gift of gold says a new king is coming. A king in whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And the other day, we went to London. And Caleb, I don't know if you know, he's obsessed with red soldiers. And I made him this little hat. It's a Beefeater hat, my attempt, which is just a black hat with a scarf shoved up it, gaffer taped onto one of his toy builder's helmet with one of Nay's necklaces on the bottom. And even though it was like the far end of Bod's job, he was chuffed to bits. And it was one of those moments of parent where you really feel like got it right. And it was really nice. But that evening at home, he was cradling this little hat like a baby in his arms, or a cuddly. And then the light caught it and he looked at me and he said, Daddy, there are fireworks inside of it. And he was, of course, referring to the way that the light caught on the gold and kind of glimmers. And that is the reason that the kings gave Jesus the gold. It's the reason in like the Old Testament and ever since kings wear gold, because of the way gold catches the light. And I guess it makes the wearer, to make it a bit Christmassy, look like a tiny star. And this is a strange point possibly to make, but if you can imagine the ancient world for a minute, there were nowhere near as many shiny things as we're used to. Like kitchens didn't have all these pans, and we're used to chrome and copper plate everywhere. We're used to everything reflecting mirrors, TV screens, whatever. But there was very little of that in the ancient world. So if someone was dressed all in gold, they would, rather than look sort of Ali G tacky, they would look otherworldly. They would look sort of spectacular in a way we can probably hardly relate to these days. And so that's why in Isaiah 60, it talks about the gift of gold as the gift of solid light. And it goes like this: from Sheba, that's Arabia, some kings will come. I combined a few bits of the same chapter. And they'll be bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord. So whether they knew it or not, these three kings bringing Jesus these three gifts were unknowingly proclaiming the praise of the Lord, saying that you are the one that we have hoped for all these years. Kind of as that song, O Come Emmanuel, that Scott did earlier. You know, you can hear the weight of hope in that song. That hope, they're saying, is met in the little baby Jesus. But it's worth us just taking a second to ask the question, what is hope? And I say that because I think it's not what we always expect it to be. So the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is kavah, and a kav is a cord. And to kavah is to pull that cord tight like this. And when you pull a cord tight, as you can kind of see, it produces this state of tension until it's released. And the tension is the word for hope, the kavah. And then the release is the fulfillment of that hope. So the picture of the word would have you understand it. So during Advent, just as an example, we kavah for Christmas. We have this tension until Christmas comes and that hope is fulfilled. And sometimes that tension can be exhausting. It can leave you feeling pulled taut if that release of fulfillment just never actually comes. That can lead to all kinds of stress and anxiety and all sorts. And just imagine, I guess, a child on Christmas surrounded by presents, hoping they can unwrap them, but never being allowed to. I know when I was tiny, it was the first thing I wanted to do, and I pretty much couldn't cope if we did it in any other order. But because of that tension that we're speaking about, it can actually be really hard to hope sometimes, can't it? It comes back to that song, O Come, Emmanuel. You can hear how hard it is to hope, how hard it is to sing that song when you have been hoping for something, in that case, for hundreds of years, for your Messiah to come. And so often it's hard for us to hope because, like, no offense, but our circumstances can get pretty hopeless, can't they? But as Christians, when we look at biblical hope, that doesn't really matter, because biblical hope isn't about your circumstances. When you feel good about the future because your circumstances look good, in a biblical way of thinking, that's something more like optimism, which is a really lovely quality, but it isn't hope. Because optimism is about choosing to see how things could work out for the best and picking that way of thinking. But biblical hope, as I said, doesn't really care about your circumstances. And in fact, hopeful people in the Bible often recognize that there's no evidence that things are going to get any better. But they choose to hope anyway, because it doesn't really matter to them. So think of an example here of another starry night, and how God spoke to an elderly, childless Abraham. And he said to him, look up at the stars, see if you can count them. That is how many descendants you'll have. And God had promised to give Abraham loads of descendants, and that through him he would bless the entire world. But judging by Abraham's circumstances, that was pretty pointless. He was old and without kids, and as we know, really old people don't have children. But Abraham's hope, it wasn't placed in his circumstances. He was able to see beyond it and place his hope in a person. And us, like Abraham, as followers of Jesus, our hope isn't placed in our circumstances either, but in a person. And because that person's been faithful to us in the past, we can trust that they'll be faithful in future as well. And to go back to our Magi, the Magi went looking for that person. They went looking for this great new king that had been promised. And so they set out sensibly to King Herod's palace to see if it was a son of his, which, in fairness to them, they get a pretty bad rap, but I think they're very sensibly expected to find a king in a palace because that's where kings typically live. It's the human way of thinking, isn't it? But the new king actually had nothing to do with Herod's family at all. And instead, they found him lying in a manger. And we have this classic idea of the nativity, don't we? It's Jesus in a manger, always, surrounded by what have we got? We got some shepherds, some sheep, some kings, Joseph in there, and there's often some halos thrown in the mix. Mary, for some reason, is always in blue. This is actually the nativity set I grew up with. So when I think of the nativity, I think of a knitted nativity. And I was thinking about that. I don't think anything that's been knitted can be gritty. It's always sanitized, isn't it? Don't get me wrong, I love knitting, if you're into knitting, but it's never earthy. So I want us this morning to try and ignore the knittedness of what the nativity's become and try and take it for what it actually is, which is that it's really weird. That's kind of the point of my talk, that the nativity is really, really wildly unexpected. It's absurd when you stop and think about it. It seems to me that it's so absurd, it's as if God takes a special Scott-like pleasure in undercutting our expectations of what he should be like and of how he, as God, should behave. So much so that you think the promised king, the one in whom all our hopes and fears are met and all these other wonderful things, is born to a peasant family, surrounded by animals who in real life weren't knitted. They smelt. He's lying in a feed trough, which is gross. He's probably screaming for his mummy in a shed in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes we can miss that element of the nativity. And when you think about that, it leaves you wondering, who would ever have expected that? I don't think you could ever have written it. When ancient pagan stories are told, their gods like Zeus or Apollo or whatever, they come as gods to earth. They don't come as babies. They come as warriors, perhaps, mighty warriors, or maybe gigantic bulls or huge eagles. That kind of thing is how they come across in myth. They never come as fragile, vulnerable, helpless, kind of useless babies. So the nativity story is quite bizarre, as I've suggested. It's the uninventable tale of what it looks like when God breaks into the human story. And then you think more about this baby, who of course is Jesus, and who the baby grows up to become, and the life that that baby goes on to lead. And of course, the fact that that baby is our God. I think it's fair to say that we worship the God of the unexpected. It's the God of the weird, the wonderful. I think you could say the wacky, the wild. To back that up, there are stories of Jesus, who is God, paying his taxes, weird enough, by catching fish that have coins in their mouths. It's a really strange story. A God who heals a blind man by rubbing spit mud in his eyes. I'd never invent that. Strolls on the sea, sends evil spirits into a herd of pigs. They go running off a cliff. Honestly, nearly every story in the gospel, when you stop and think, it's pretty strange. He's the God who dies a criminal's death for us on a cross. The ultimate twist. Throughout his life, and I tested this by scanning the different gospels just to check pretty much, all the headings, the stories, and thinking about it, Jesus was different, like really different, is a nice way of putting it. In every situation that he was in, people expected Jesus to behave one way, and they never learned. He would then do something entirely unthought of, and entirely confounding. And I think that's the word I landed on as summing up what I've been thinking about this morning, is that God is confounding. He is completely unexpected. Because you and I, we're like the Magi. I think it's fair to say we expect to find kings in palaces, don't we? We don't expect old people to have babies. We don't pay taxes, sadly, via fish gold. The world works in a certain way. We're used to how the world works. And for whatever reason, it's hard for us to escape some very rigid ways of thinking about things. And so just as we continue into sort of the last leg of the talk, try and keep this idea of Jesus in your mind, of Jesus as confounding and unexpected, because I want to think now about what that means for us. That God, who we worship, is so unexpected, and he behaves so unexpectedly. Just to quickly recap, we place our hope in a person, and that person is Jesus. And we know that we can trust him because he's always been faithful in the past. But, and I can't stress this point enough, we can't begin to predict him. And I think that's really important. So just to remember from earlier, this tight chord, the kavah, you might look at the state of your life and you might see no way to put the pieces of it back together again. Because frankly, optimism sometimes is just misguided. You can sometimes have a glass that's half full. Sometimes your glass is half empty. But then sometimes it's like someone has run off with your glass entirely. And There's no point pretending it's a great situation, because there might not be a way you or I could piece your life back together again. But hopeful followers of Jesus that we are, we don't need evidence that things are going to get better, because we choose to hope in Jesus anyway. So remember briefly, Christmas. It is Christmas, and the Christmas story tells us this. When God breaks into your story, you have no idea what he's going to do with it. You have no idea where he'll take it, and no idea how you'll get there. We rely on our circumstances because without God, it's all we've got. We don't have anything else to work with. But God doesn't need your circumstances. He's bigger than them, and he thinks differently to them. And where we can be so focused on our expectations, God is waiting to undercut those expectations in some of the most wonderful and life-giving ways possible. But it does kind of mean you've got to roll with it a little bit. I was reminded as I was preparing this of this really corny American bumper sticker. It's very American. It says, "Jesus, take the wheel." I'm not a fan of stuff like that, if I'm honest with you. But the idea is, let Jesus take charge of your life. And I think it's because he's a pretty good driver, I think, is the implication of your life. But we could think about it like this. Imagine your life's a car. And you're driving on a road, but suddenly the road practically falls away. It's like driving into Maidenhead, and it's more pothole than tarmac. It's too hard for you to drive anymore. So you give Jesus the wheel. And you're wondering at this point how he will navigate the madness of this failed road surface. And imagine in this case that instead of driving carefully along the road and slowing down to navigate each little pothole, Jesus checks you have your seatbelt on, whips up the handbrake, fully turns the wheel, J-turns off-road into the unexpected. I think that's kind of a better way of thinking about what that bumper sticker might mean for us at Christmas. Anyway, moving on. I've been lucky enough to know many old saints. And one of the things I've noticed, and you don't really even have to be a person following Jesus for that long to have learnt this lesson, but they all say something like this. They say, I could never have predicted what God would do next. And I find myself maybe imagining Abraham saying, I would never have predicted God would give me children at my age. I imagine the Magi saying, the last place I expected to find God is lying in a feed trough. And maybe imagine myself, perhaps yourself, in however many years, looking back on now thinking, that is the last thing I expected God to do. And the whole point of this talk, which is about finished, is that the message of Christmas is that you can hope. Whenever your life is making you feel like this state of tension will go on forever with your hopes remaining entirely unfulfilled, whatever is in the way, whatever is getting between them, the story of Christmas reminds us that it doesn't matter how big or small it is, because we place our hope not in those circumstances, but in a person. We place our hopes in Jesus, and Jesus, of course, is a king. And that king is our God, and he's a God who speaks in the stars, as we saw earlier, and a God who brings new life. To put it in my new favourite phrase, he's our confounding king. So if Scott, you're able to nip up. I just had a few thoughts about perhaps some different people that might want to think through this as we move into time of prayer, and then I'll hand back to Adam and the band. It might be nice for us just to stand for a minute, if you want to, able to. Maybe you don't really want to, that's fine. Just put out our hands. And just to think, maybe on the one hand, your life, the word in my mind is stagnant, has grown still, and you feel like maybe this Christmas, the shining light in your sky for you might mean that God wants to do something unexpected and new in your life. Or it might be that you're part of a different group of people who perhaps your situation just feels hopeless, and you find yourself feeling maybe like that state of tension, like your hopes will never be fulfilled. And in which case, firstly, it would be really great to pray for you now, but also really encourage you to go to a prayer place or go and find someone else to pray with. We'd all love to pray with you. But we'll pray and then go straight into some worship. Jesus, we thank you how unexpected you are. We thank you that you work differently to us, and there's hope in that. So as we put out our hands this morning just to welcome the new, we pray that you would bring the new in our lives this Christmas. Where things have grown stagnant and old, where we've been carrying unmet hopes for too long, we see that one of the things you do at Christmas is put a bright light in the sky that says a new creation is coming. I'm doing something new. And we just receive that this morning. And for those of us where hope has become heavy, we pray this morning that you would help us to place our hope into you and not into our circumstances, and to trust you with that. In Jesus' name.